The letter said he was a decent man. That was all her uncle wrote, decent, as though decency were enough to hand a woman over like a piece of land being sold at auction. Verity Marsh folded that letter so many times the crease went soft, and she kept it in her coat pocket the whole 3 days on the train west from Fredericton, not because she wanted to read it again, but because holding something, anything, felt better than holding nothing at all. She was 23 years old. Her mother had been dead 6 years. Her father had been dead too, and her uncle, Douglas Crane, had sat across from her at his kitchen table in late October and told her, in the same tone he used to discuss fence repairs, that he could not keep her through another winter. The farm wasn't making enough. His own children needed the room. He'd written to a man out in Alberta, a rancher, a widower, who was looking for a capable woman to help manage the household. There would be a contract. It was all very proper. Verity had looked at the pattern on his tablecloth while he spoke and thought, so this is how it happens. Not with shouting. Not with cruelty, even. Just a man deciding what to do with a woman the way you decide what to do with a horse that costs too much to feed. She didn't argue. There was no argument to be made that Douglas would hear. She asked only 2 questions. Was the man kind? Douglas had said decent. Was there a way back if things went wrong? Douglas had looked at the tablecloth himself then, and said nothing. So she packed 1 trunk and took the train. The town of Creston Flat, Alberta, was smaller than she'd expected from the name. A general store, a livery, a post office that doubled as the telegraph office, and a church with a crooked steeple that made the whole place look like it was leaning slightly into the wind. She stepped off the train into cold that had teeth in it, the kind of cold she hadn't felt even in New Brunswick, and stood on the platform with her trunk at her feet and nobody there to meet her. She waited 40 minutes. She watched the train leave. She watched 2 men unload freight crates, watched a woman in a gray coat walk past without looking at her, watched a dog cross the main street and disappear between 2 buildings. Then a wagon came up the road from the south, moving at the unhurried pace of a man who didn't think he was late for anything. He pulled the horses to a stop in front of the platform and looked down at her from the wagon seat. He was older than she'd imagined, somewhere in his late 30s, maybe touching 40, with dark hair going gray at the sides and a jaw that hadn't seen a razor in several days. He had the kind of face that had been weathered into something harder than it probably started as. He didn't smile. "Miss Marsh," he said, not a question. "Yes," she said. "I'm Garrett Holt." He climbed down from the wagon. He was taller than she'd expected. He looked at her trunk, looked at her, and then picked up the trunk and loaded it into the wagon bed without asking. "Train was early," he said, which wasn't an apology but seemed to be the closest thing she'd get to one. She climbed up to the wagon seat herself. He came around and climbed up beside her. He clicked at the horses and they moved. And that was the introduction. Her name, his name, the explanation about the train that wasn't quite an apology, and then the empty road south through flat country, where the grass had gone the color of old straw and the sky sat on top of everything like a lid. He didn't speak again for the better part of an hour. Verity looked at the land. She'd grown up with trees around her, with hills, with the sense that the horizon was always hiding something. Here the horizon hid nothing. You could see everything coming from miles away, and there was a particular loneliness to that, she thought. Not the loneliness of being surrounded by walls, but the loneliness of too much open space and not enough of it being yours. "How far is the ranch?" she finally asked. "Another hour and a bit," Garrett said. "How many children?" He glanced at her sideways. 2, boy and a girl. Matthew's 9, Leah's 6. Who's been looking after them? Neighbor woman comes by 3 times a week, Mrs. Fenn. She's getting on and it's a long ride for her. Verity nodded. She looked back at the land. "What happened to your wife?" she asked, because she felt she had a right to know that much at least, and because she'd learned that if you wanted an honest answer from a man like this, you had to ask the question directly, or you'd never get an answer at all. Garrett was quiet for a moment. The horse's hooves were steady on the frozen ground. "Fever," he said. 2 years ago, this March, I'm sorry." He didn't say anything to that. She hadn't expected him to. The house was bigger than she'd thought it would be. Not fine, not by any measure, but solid, 2-story, built to last by someone who intended to stay. There were outbuildings, a barn that needed its roof patched on the east side, a chicken coop, a pen with 3 pigs. The yard was not tidy, but it wasn't hopeless either. It had the look of a place where there had once been enough hands to keep things right, and now there weren't. The children were inside. Leah came to the door when she heard the wagon and stood in the doorway, with her arms crossed in a posture. Verity recognized immediately as a child who has learned that strangers don't always mean good news. She had her father's coloring and a gap between her front teeth, and she looked at Verity with the grave directness of a child who has been through something and knows it. Matthew came up behind his sister and looked around her at Verity with an expression that was more carefully neutral, old enough to have decided that neutrality was safer than showing anything. "This is Miss Marsh," Garrett said. He was carrying her trunk up the steps. "She's going to help manage the house." Leah said. "Is she staying?" "For a while," Garrett said. Verity crouched down slightly so she was closer to Leah's eye level, which she knew some children liked and some children didn't. "I make decent bread," she said, "if that's worth anything to you." Leah studied her for another moment. Then she stepped back from the doorway to let Verity in. Her room was small, a narrow bed, a window that faced west, a washstand, a hook on the wall. There were curtains on the window that someone had made from flour sacking and dyed a faded blue. She stood in the room after Garrett had set her trunk down and gone without ceremony, and she looked at those curtains for a long time. Someone had gone to the trouble of making them. Someone had wanted the room to look like it belonged to a person, and not just a function. She took off her coat and hung it on the hook and went to find the kitchen. The contract she'd signed with her uncle and Garrett's name on it said she was to manage the household, cook and clean, see to the children's schooling, and assist where needed with the kitchen garden in season. In exchange, she'd receive room and board and a modest monthly wage paid quarterly. It was not a marriage contract exactly, though it had the shape of one. She was not his wife. She was something harder to name, more than hired help, less than family, existing in the space in between with no particular map for how to navigate it. She made bread that first night because she'd said she would, and it was the one thing she knew how to do that required no conversation, no negotiation, no sorting out of where she stood. She made bread and she fed it to the children, and Leah ate 3 pieces and said nothing, which Verity understood to be a compliment. Garrett ate at the table with them and then went back outside. She didn't see him again until dark. The first month was like learning to read in a language where you recognize the letters, but not the words. She found where things were kept, not because anyone showed her, but because she opened every drawer and cupboard until she knew. She found the state of the pantry, which was worse than it should have been. She found the state of the children's clothing, which was also worse than it should have been. Not from neglect exactly, but from the way things slip, when only one person is trying to hold everything together, and that one person's primary job is outside. Matthew warmed to her slowly, the way shy animals do, coming closer by degrees, offering information in fragments. He told her about his teacher in town, Mr. Albright, who smelled like pipe tobacco and had a way of explaining sums that made sense. He told her the names of his father's horses. He told her, eventually and in a rush, that he missed his mother, and then looked immediately as though he wished he hadn't said it. So Verity just said, "Of course you do," and went back to what she was doing. And he seemed relieved not to have made it into a moment. Leah was different. Leah watched everything and said what she thought, which meant that by the end of the first week she had told Verity that the bread was better than Mrs. Fenn's, that she didn't like the color of Verity's second dress, and that she thought it wasn't fair that women had to do all the inside work while men did all the outside work. Verity had looked at her and said she thought Leah was probably right about that, and Leah had looked so startled to have an adult agree with her about anything that she went quiet for almost a whole day. Garrett, she watched the way you watch weather, from a distance trying to read signs. He was not unkind. He was not warm. He came in for meals and ate what was put in front of him without complaint and without particular comment, and he helped Matthew with his arithmetic on Tuesday evenings with a patience that surprised her, and he carried Leah to bed when she fell asleep in the chair by the fire without making any fuss about it. He did these things with the quiet efficiency of a man who has stripped his life down to what needs doing and does not have the energy for anything beyond that. He hadn't laughed once in the first month that Verity heard. She didn't ask him to. She was not there to fix him. She told herself that every time she caught herself watching him across the supper table, trying to figure out what he'd looked like before whatever weight he was carrying had gotten into his face and settled there. In January, the trouble started. She'd known something was wrong with the finances before he told her. She could see it in the patched and patched again equipment, in the way he'd looked when she'd mentioned the pantry needed restocking, in the small and careful way he said, "We'll make do about things that should not have required making do." She had started keeping track, quietly, in a small notebook she bought from the general store on one of the twice-monthly trips to Creston Flat, of what came in and what went out, because she had grown up in a household that ran thin and she knew the shape of it. She didn't tell him she was doing this. She wasn't sure he'd welcome it. The storm came in the second week of January and kept them indoors for 4 days. On the third day, Garrett came in from checking on the cattle in the early afternoon, frost on his beard and a look on his face that she'd learned to read as the specific expression of a problem with no clean answer. He sat down at the kitchen table, and she put coffee in front of him without being asked, because that was a thing she'd learned. That he didn't ask for much, but that having things appear when he needed them seemed to matter to him in some way he'd never articulate. "Lost 2 head in the north pasture," he said. She sat down across from him. "How many does that leave you?" He looked at her then, really looked at her, the way he almost never did directly, as though she'd surprised him by asking a question with a number in it, instead of saying something soft and useless. 63, he said. "Needed to sell in the spring to cover the equipment loan. 2 head doesn't change the math enough, but it changes it. Can you extend the loan? Tried in November. Stetler won't go another season. What if you sold the East Quarter?" Garrett looked at his coffee. "That land was my wife's family's," he said quietly. "I know," Verity said. "I'm not saying you should. I'm asking if you could." There was a long silence. The wind hit the side of the house, and the children were upstairs, and outside everything was white. "Maybe," he said at last. She opened her notebook. She hadn't planned to show him, but she thought now was the right time, or there might not be another one. She slid it across the table. He looked at it. He turned the pages slowly, studying the columns she'd kept, the numbers she'd tracked, the small notations about where cuts could be made and where they couldn't. When he'd gone through all of it, he put it down and looked at her, and there was something in his face she hadn't seen there before. Not gratitude exactly, something closer to recognition. Like someone who has been in a dark room for a long time and has just noticed there's a window. "You did this on your own," he said. "I thought someone should know the whole picture," Verity said. He was quiet for another moment. "I'm not used to," he started and then stopped. "I know," she said. She didn't say having help. She didn't need to. He picked the notebook up again and looked at it as though it were something he hadn't expected to find. Outside the wind came again and the house stood against it, which was all it needed to do. Things shifted after that, not suddenly. The way things shift in cold country, gradually enough that you can't point to the exact moment, only look back from somewhere warmer and realize how far you've come. He started talking to her at supper. Not much at first. A comment about the cattle, a word about the weather, a question once about whether she thought Leah's cough needed a doctor. But it grew by degrees into something that had the shape of conversation, where one person said something and the other answered, and there was a small silence, and then someone said something else. And it was not the silence of 2 strangers enduring each other, but the silence of 2 people who have gotten used to being in the same space. Leah noticed before Verity did. She was that kind of child. One evening she watched her father say something to Verity about the spring planting, and watched Verity answer and watched her father almost smile. Almost, just the edge of it. And then Leah looked at Verity with an expression that was too complicated for 6 years old, and that Verity couldn't quite interpret. Later, when Verity was tucking her in, Leah said, "Do you like my papa? I think he's a good man," Verity said carefully. "He doesn't laugh very much since Mama died," Leah said. "I know. He used to." Leah turned onto her side and pulled the quilt up. "He's better now, though, since you came." She said it without sentiment, as a statement of observed fact. "Good night, Verity." Verity stood in the doorway for a moment after the lamp was low. "He's better now." She went downstairs and washed the supper dishes, and didn't let herself think about it for very long. March was when the man from town came. His name was Barwell Coombs, one of the men who'd had a claim on a parcel of land adjacent to Garrett's property, and who had, by all accounts Verity had gathered from Mrs. Fenn's visits, been trying for 2 years to get Garrett to sell the East Quarter at below value. He came on a Tuesday afternoon when Garrett was out on the far side of the property, and Verity was in the yard hanging washing. He was a large man, the kind of large that is less about height and more about the space a man decides he is entitled to take up. He stopped his horse at the gate and looked at her in a way she recognized and didn't like, the way of a man cataloging whether you're worth accounting for. "Holt in?" he said. "No," Verity said. She kept hanging the washing. "When's he back?" "I couldn't say." Coombs stayed where he was. "You're the woman he brought in," he said. Not quite a question, and not quite a statement, and the tone of it designed to do something small and mean. Verity looked at him directly. "I manage the house," she said. He smiled. The kind of smile that doesn't come from anything friendly. "Must be convenient," he said, "for a man in Holt's situation, having a woman on the property." She looked at him for a long moment. She did not say anything because she had learned when she was very young that certain men are testing you when they talk, and the thing they want most is a reaction, and the best thing you can give them is nothing. "Tell Holt I came by," Coombs said. "Tell him my offer on the East Quarter is still open." He left. Verity went back to the washing. Her hands were steady and she was glad of it. She told Garrett that evening. He listened with his jaw tight and asked her if Coombs had said or done anything beyond what she'd described. She said no. He said, good. He sat with it for a moment. He won't give up, he said. He's been at that land for 2 years. I know, Verity said. He came when he thought you weren't here. Garrett looked at her. Next time, he said, you don't have to manage him alone. It was not an apology for the situation. It was not a declaration of anything. But it was the first time he'd said something that meant you're not alone in this house. And she felt it settle somewhere in her chest, in a way she'd have been embarrassed to explain. Spring came late that year, but it came, and with it the particular chaos of a ranch waking up from winter, calves born in bad weather, fences to check and repair, the east field to prep for the kitchen garden. Verity worked alongside Mrs. Fenn in the garden when she could, and supervised Matthew and Leah with their morning lessons before they made the ride to school in town. She wrote letters to her uncle's wife, not to Douglas, describing the weather, the children, the landscape. She didn't describe Garrett, because she wasn't sure what she'd say. At the end of April, he paid her quarterly wage in cash on the kitchen table the way the contract specified. She counted it because she always counted money, and he didn't seem to find that strange. She put it away and said thank you, and he said nothing, and she understood that for him this was a formal moment. The proof that this was an arrangement, that she was compensated, that it was all above board and documented. She'd gotten the impression that it was important to him, that nothing about the situation looked like something it wasn't. She respected that. She just wasn't always sure, anymore, what it was. The night in early May that she knew something had changed, that she knew it in herself, which was different from noticing it, was a night when Leah was sick. Not dangerously, but enough. A high fever that had Verity up every hour through the night, with cold cloths and water, and the careful managing of fear that you do when you're watching a child, and waiting to see which way the fever breaks. Garrett was up with her, had come in from his room, when he heard Leah crying at 2 a.m, and had not gone back. He sat on the other side of the bed, and they worked without speaking, each taking what needed doing, and at some point, close to 4 a.m, the fever broke, and Leah's breathing evened out, and Verity sat back in the chair she'd pulled next to the bed and let out a long, slow breath. She looked up and found Garrett watching her. She'll sleep now, Verity said. Yes, he said. She should have gotten up and gone to bed. She was tired enough that the room had the soft, blurred edges of late-night fatigue. But she didn't get up. She sat there, and so did he. And the lamp was turned down low, and after a while he said, I don't know what I'd do if something happened to her. It wasn't said to her specifically. It was said into the room, to the fact of his daughter sleeping. But she was the one there, the one who heard it. She's all right, Verity said. I know. He rubbed a hand over his face. I couldn't after her mother. I couldn't bear it. Verity looked at Leah's sleeping face, the faint color coming back into her cheeks. She's strong, she said. She gets that from somewhere. Garrett looked at Verity again, and she knew he was looking at her, not past her. She felt it the way you feel weather before it arrives. You've been... He stopped, started again. You've been good for them, he said. Good for her. For Matthew. I care about them, Verity said simply. I know you do. His voice was low and careful. I'm not sure I understood that at first. What it would look like when someone actually cared about them the way you do. She didn't say anything. She wasn't sure she could without her voice doing something she didn't want it to do. Verity, he said. Just her name. The way he said it was entirely different from the way he had said Miss Marsh on the train platform in October. And the difference between those two things was months of early mornings and difficult evenings, and 2 children learning to trust again, and 1 man learning, slowly and with great effort, to do the same. Yes, she said. He looked at her for a long time in the low light, his daughter sleeping between them. I don't think of you as the woman I hired, he said. I haven't for a while. I don't know what the right way is to say the rest of it. You don't have to find the right way, Verity said. Not tonight. He nodded once, and she thought that was all it would be, and she thought that was all right, that some things take the time they need. But then he said, very quietly, I'd like you to stay, not because of the house or the children, because of... He stopped. His hands were on his knees, and he looked down at them and then up at her. Because of this, he said, which was not eloquent and was not much of anything as declarations went, but was the most honest thing she'd heard from him and probably the hardest. She looked at his face in the low light. The weight that had lived there since October had shifted, not gone, but sitting differently. I'm not going anywhere, she said. Summer came and she stayed. The East Quarter didn't sell, not to Coombs. In July, when Garrett sold the spring cattle and cleared the equipment loan, he hired a hand for the season, a young man from Lacombe named Trent Sayers, who worked quietly and well, and who was good with the horses, which made Matthew follow him around with unconcealed admiration for most of August. The roof on the barn got patched. The kitchen garden came in better than the year before. Leah had insisted on having a row of her own for flowers, and Verity had let her. And by August there were zinnias in a jam jar on the kitchen table every week, which made the house look the way it should have always looked. She wrote to her Uncle Douglas at the end of the summer. Not a long letter, not an emotional one. She told him she was well. She told him the arrangement had worked out. She told him she thought she might be here for a good while longer. She did not tell him what that meant, because she did not think he had earned that. One evening in late August, she was sitting on the porch steps watching the light go sideways across the flat land, the way it did at that hour, going gold and then red, and Garrett came out and sat down beside her. Not a chair, the step which put him close. The children were inside. It was the particular quiet of a late summer evening in country where the nearest neighbor is 5 miles away, and it was not an uncomfortable quiet. Matthew asked me today, Garrett said, if we were going to get married. Verity looked at the light moving across the grass. What did you tell him? That it was something we might talk about, Garrett said. Him and me and you. She was quiet for a moment. A hawk moved across the sky above the east pasture, unhurried. Is that what you'd like to talk about? She said. It's what I'd like, he said, careful and direct in the way he was always careful and direct when something mattered to him. If it's what you'd like too. She thought about the train from Fredericton. The letter that said decent. The platform in Creston Flat where no one was waiting and the cold had teeth in it. The flour sack curtains in her room that someone had dyed blue because they'd wanted the room to feel like it belonged to a person. She thought about Leah's flowers in a jam jar on the table. Matthew reciting his times tables in the kitchen while she made supper. A notebook full of numbers slid across a table and a man looking at her like someone noticing a window. She looked at Garrett beside her on the step. He was watching her, not the light. Waiting the way he waited for everything, without pushing, with that particular stillness of a man who has learned that some things can't be hurried. Yes, she said, it's what I'd like. He didn't say anything else right away, but he didn't move away either, and after a moment, his hand found hers on the step between them and held it, and they sat there until the light finished doing what it was doing across all that open land, and then they went inside to where the children were.